The dust of the frontier town clings to her worn skirts, each grain a testament to a journey undertaken for a hope now crumbling. She steps down from the stagecoach, her flawed gait earning instant scorn, a mail-order bride with a limp, already condemned by a chorus of whispers in the unforgiving air of Stone Creek. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe survival can lead to love, hit like and subscribe for more. For in this harsh land, one man, marked by his own battles, sees not a flaw, but a spirit unbroken, and he will make a stand that silences them all. The dry heat of Stone Creek met Alara Hayes like a slap. Her leg, the one that had betrayed her since a fever stole its perfect strength in childhood, throbbed with the jolting miles. As she descended the coach steps, her grip desperate on the rail, a hush fell over the small assembly outside the dusty mercantile. Then, a snicker, sharp and cruel as shattered glass. "Well, looky here," a woman's voice, raw with disdain, cut through the silence. "The new Mrs. Albright's got a hitch in her get-along." More laughter followed, a wave of derision that washed over Alara, hot and shameful. The man who was to be Mr. Albright, a portly, red-faced merchant she'd only seen in a smudged daguerreotype, pushed forward, his face a mask of disbelief, then disgust. He took one look at her uneven posture, the way she favored her left leg, and his jaw tightened. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of welcome. He simply turned to the stage driver. "There's been a mistake. Send her back." The driver, a weary man, shrugged. "Can't. Payment's made for one way. She's your concern now, Albright, or the town's." Albright spat on the ground, the sound echoing Alara's sinking heart. He stalked back into his store without a backward glance, the crowd parting for him, then reforming to stare at her, the unwanted, damaged goods. Alara stood alone, the small, battered trunk containing all her worldly possessions at her feet. The whispers swirled around her. Damaged. A cripple. What use is she? Each word was a fresh barb. Her journey west had been fueled by a desperate prayer for a new beginning, a place where the whispers of her small eastern village wouldn't follow. She had hoped that a man seeking a wife in such a remote place would value fortitude over flawless form. She had been wrong. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, expecting another jeer. Instead, a man stood a little apart from the crowd, his face unreadable. He was tall, lean, with eyes that seemed to hold the vast, empty plains. One side of his face bore a faint, silvered scar, and he moved with a stiffness in his right shoulder, a subtle echo of her own imperfection. He wasn't looking at her with pity or malice, but with a quiet, assessing gaze that made her skin prickle. He said nothing, just watched, as if cataloguing the cruelty of his neighbors. This was Silas Thorne, a veteran of the war, a man who kept to himself at the edge of town, his silence as much a fixture as the wind that scoured Stone Creek. The mercy, if it could be called that, came from the parson's wife, a woman whose strained smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She arranged for Alara to occupy a tiny, abandoned trapper's cabin on the creek bank, a place little more than a lean-to against the biting winds. Until other arrangements can be made, she'd said, the implication clear, Alara was a temporary problem. The days that followed were a blur of aching loneliness and biting humiliation. Her limp, always a source of quiet shame, became a public spectacle. Every trip to the mercantile for meager supplies was an ordeal. Children would point and sometimes mimic her gait, their parents offering no reprimand. Women would fall silent as she approached, their eyes following her with cold curiosity. Men would nudge each other, their leers making her stomach churn. She learned to make her trips brief, to keep her eyes downcast, to move as quickly as her rebellious leg would allow, though haste often made her stumble, inviting fresh mockery. The cabin was cold. The small stove consumed wood faster than she could gather it. Her hands grew raw from chopping kindling, her body sore from the unaccustomed labor. The pain in her leg was a constant companion, a dull throb that sharpened with fatigue. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the coyotes yipped and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, she would weep, silent, bitter tears for the hope that had died in the dust of Stone Creek. Silas Thorne remained a peripheral figure. She'd see him sometimes, heading into the hills with his rifle, or at the smithy, his movements economical and precise despite the old wound that pulled at his shoulder. He never spoke to her. He never acknowledged her beyond a fleeting, unreadable glance if their paths crossed at a distance. Yet, small things began to happen. One morning, after a particularly vicious windstorm had scattered her poorly stacked firewood, she found it neatly piled by her door. Another day, a rabbit, cleaned and ready for the pot, lay on her doorstep. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. She suspected Thorne, but the thought was unsettling. Why would he, a man as much an outsider as she, offer kindness? She had nothing to give in return. The mockery, however, did not cease. It festered, growing bolder. One afternoon, as Alara struggled to carry a sack of flour from the mercantile, her leg buckled. The sack burst, spilling its precious contents into the muddy street. A roar of laughter went up from the men loitering on the boardwalk. Albright himself stood in his doorway, a smirk on his face. Clumsy as a newborn calf, he boomed. Tears of frustration and shame pricked Alara's eyes. She knelt, trying to scoop the ruined flour back into the ripped sack, her hands trembling. Then, Silas Thorne was there. He didn't speak. He simply walked past the laughing men, his expression unyielding. He knelt beside her, and with his good hand, began to help her gather what little flour could be salvaged. His presence, silent and resolute, seemed to cast a pall over the mockers. The laughter died down, replaced by uneasy murmurs. He didn't look at her, didn't offer any false comfort. He simply helped, his actions a quiet rebuke to the town's cruelty. When they had gathered what they could, he rose, lifted the significantly lighter sack as if it weighed nothing, and carried it to her cabin. He placed it inside the door, met her eyes for a brief, searching moment, then turned and walked away, his own gait slightly uneven, a mirror to her own imperfect journey. That small act of solidarity, offered without expectation, shifted something within Alara. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a lessening of the crushing weight of her isolation. She began to watch him, to notice the way he navigated his own pain, the quiet dignity with which he bore his scars. She saw the townsfolk give him a wide berth, not out of respect, but a kind of wary discomfort. He was a reminder of the war, of its costs, something they preferred to forget. The winter deepened, and so did the town's resentment of her presence. She was a burden, a drain on their meager resources, a reminder of Albright's folly. Talk began to circulate that she should be sent to the county poor farm, a grim prospect. Alara redoubled her efforts to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, but her limp was a constant announcement of her otherness. One biting morning, the creek frozen solid along its edges, Alara ventured out for firewood further than usual. A sudden blizzard swept down from the mountains, a blinding white fury. Disoriented, her leg aching fiercely in the cold, she stumbled and fell, twisting her ankle. Pain, sharp and sickening, shot up her leg. She tried to rise, but the ankle wouldn't bear her weight. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind, seized her. She was alone, injured, and the snow was falling faster, burying the landscape in a featureless white. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into her bones, her shouts for help swallowed by the storm. Just as a numb despair began to claim her, a figure emerged from the swirling snow. Silas. He moved with a grim determination, his eyes scanning the ground. He found her, half buried in a drift. Without a word, he knelt, his examination of her ankle swift and surprisingly gentle. His touch, though calloused, did not sicken her. He met her gaze, his own filled with a concern that was devoid of pity. Broken, she managed, her teeth chattering. He shook his head. Sprained. Badly. He then proceeded, with an efficiency that spoke of long practice in harsh conditions, to fashion a makeshift splint from branches and strips of his own kerchief. Then, carefully, he lifted her. Elara was mortified by her helplessness, but his arms were strong, his hold secure. He carried her back towards the town, battling the wind and the deepening snow, his breath rasping in the frozen air. He did not falter. He did not complain. He simply endured, his strength a shield against the storm. He took her not to her own miserable cabin, but to his, a slightly larger, sturdier structure at the very edge of Stone Creek, almost in the shadow of the looming hills. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth. The space was Spartan but clean, organized. He laid her gently on his own narrow bunk, then set about tending to her ankle with a practiced hand, using a salve that smelled of pine and herbs. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. Elara watched him, a strange warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. It was gratitude, yes, but something more, something that acknowledged the shared space of their quiet sufferings. He brewed a hot, bitter tea, and made her drink it. "Rest," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but not unkind. He then sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the silence between them no longer strained, but companionable. She stayed in his cabin for 3 days while the blizzard raged and then slowly subsided. He tended to her injury, shared his meager food, and kept the fire stoked. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant comfort. She learned the rhythm of his quiet life, the way he mended his own clothes with surprising neatness, the intent focus he brought to every small task. She saw the lines of old pain etched around his eyes, the way his shoulder sometimes seized up. He was as flawed, as marked by life, as she was. And in that shared imperfection, a fragile understanding began to bloom. When the paths were finally clear enough for her to return to her own cabin, propped on a crude crutch he'd fashioned, the town was abuzz. Silas Thorne, the recluse, sheltering the limping mail-order bride. The scandal was delicious to them. Albright, in particular, seemed incensed, his proprietary anger reignited. A week later, the parson, his face grave, called a town meeting in the unheated shell of the church. Elara knew, with a sinking heart, what it was about. She was to be officially cast out. As she limped towards the church, leaning heavily on her crutch, the whispers were louder, the stares more pointed. Inside, the small building was packed. Albright stood near the front, his arms crossed, a self-righteous scowl on his face. The parson cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice echoing in the cold space, "to discuss a matter of concern to the community. The unfortunate situation of Miss Hayes." He was interrupted. The door at the back of the church opened, and Silas Thorne stepped inside. He moved with his usual quiet purpose, but there was a new steel in his spine, a dangerous light in his eyes. He walked down the aisle, the crowd parting before him as if he were an avenging angel. He stopped beside Elara. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the warmth of his presence, a bulwark against the cold hostility of the room. Albright sneered. "Well, Thorne. Come to watch the outcast get her due." Silas turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Albright. His voice, when he spoke, was low, but it carried to every corner of the room, clear and unwavering. "Miss Hayes will not be going anywhere." A stunned silence fell. The parson gaped. Albright's face purpled. "She is not your concern," Silas continued, his eyes sweeping over the assembled townsfolk, meeting every hostile stare with an unblinking challenge. "She is mine." He then turned to Elara. For the first time, his eyes held an emotion she could clearly read, a fierce protectiveness, a quiet offer. He extended his scarred, capable hand. "Elara," he said, her name a soft sound in the vast silence. "These people don't decide your worth." He paused, his gaze holding hers, unwavering and true. "I would be honored if you would be my wife." The gasp that rippled through the church was audible. Albright looked apoplectic. But Elara saw only Silas. She saw the truth in his eyes, the acceptance, the strength that asked for nothing but offered everything. The shame that had clung to her for so long seemed to loosen its grip, to fall away like a worn-out cloak. Her own hand, trembling slightly, rose to meet his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. The pain in her leg was still there, a familiar ache, but it no longer defined her. Before them all, before the mocking town of Stone Creek, she nodded, a single, affirming movement. A small, tremulous smile touched her lips. He had not erased her limp, nor the town's cruelty, but he had given her something far more precious, a place to stand, a hand to hold, and the promise of a dawn unburdened by solitude. The silence in the church stretched, no longer stunned, but something akin to awe, or perhaps, the first reluctant seeds of shame in the hearts of those who had judged so harshly. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more.